Our next speaker is John S. Thompson. He obtained his BA and MA in Ancient Near Eastern Studies, Hebrew Bible from BYU and UC Berkeley, respectively, and completed a PhD in Egyptology at the University of Pennsylvania. He was an employee of the Seminaries and Institute of Religion for 28 years, most recently as coordinator and institute director in the Cambridge, Massachusetts area. Now a full-time researcher and writer for Scripture Central, John's research and interests and publications focus primarily on early Egyptian religion, the Book of Abraham, as well as ancient and modern priesthood temple ritual and covenant theology. He and his wife Stacy make their home in Orem, Utah, where they welcome their 9 children and 4 grandchildren. With that, we'll turn the time over to John.
Thank you, Scott. Just a personal note before we get started. I feel a little self-conscious today. I suffered a paralysis of my face just a few days ago, and so if it looks like I'm trying to mimic Popeye the Sailor as I speak, that may explain a little bit more about why. It also becomes more apparent when I smile, so I'll try to maintain a nice scholarly stoicism through my presentation so I don't alarm people. But so here we go. Some confusion exists in the written historical sources concerning the number and nature of the transcripts that Martin Harris presented to Professor Charles Anthon at Columbia College in 1828. Some of the sources seem to indicate, and standard thinking has asserted, that Harris showed Anthon one document on which was written a collection of characters copied from the golden plates. However, other sources, including the canonized account of Harris's visit with Anthon, recorded in Joseph Smith History, chapter 1, verses 63 to 65, suggests that Harris may have shown Anthon at least 2 pieces of paper, as B.H. Roberts already noted long ago. Harris's canonized report, as it appears in the manuscript of the History of the Church begun in 1838, states, "I went to the city of New York and presented the characters which have been translated, with the translation thereof, to Professor Charles Anthon, a gentleman celebrated for his literary attainments. Professor Anthon stated that the translation was correct, more so than he had before seen translated from the Egyptian. I then showed him those which were not yet translated, and he said that they were Egyptian or Chaldaic or Syriac and Arabic, and he said that they were true characters." While the number of documents is actually not addressed in this report, and therefore uncertain, Martin Harris does explicitly state that he presented Anthon 2 different sets of characters. One set that was translated, and another set that was not yet translated, those labeled C1 and C2 here in the slide. He also reports Anthon's differing responses to these 2 sets of characters, those labeled R1 and R2 in the slide. These details provide some additional possibilities to consider with respect to the kinds of characters Anthon was shown, as well as Anthon's ability to identify or translate them. A third-hand source in 1831 also suggested that Harris, with several manuscripts in his pocket, went to the city of New York and called upon one of the professors of Columbia College for the purpose of showing them to him. So a little background will be helpful here. Apart from the multiple documents mentioned in the source on the previous slide, and Charles Anthon's personal letters, wherein he only mentions being shown a singular document, most of the sources actually say little to nothing about the number of documents that may have been carried by Harris and presented to Anthon in this episode of church history. For example, Joseph Smith's 1832 history merely indicates that some of the characters were copied for Martin Harris to take with him to the East. There is no reference to the number of documents created. Orson Pratt's 1840 history is likewise vague. Joseph Smith's 1838 history states, "Immediately after my arrival in Pennsylvania, I commenced copying the characters of all the plates. Of the plates. I copied a considerable number of them, and by means of the Urim and Thummim, I translated some of them. As in the 1832 account, nothing in this version indicates the number of documents made, only that a considerable number of characters were copied somewhere, and that some of these documents or characters were translated. That is as far as these sentences allow one to go when creating history. It cannot even be determined where the translation was written. Was it right next to the characters on the same document? Was it on a separate document? It's not clear. Note that this text originally stated Joseph Smith copied characters of all the plates. But then all is crossed out, presumably because it goes too far. But the initial reading and correction certainly gives the impression that characters were copied from more than one plate, just not all of them. Indeed, more recent scholarship has demonstrated that Joseph Smith may have created many copies of characters from the golden plates while he possessed them, some having different formats or appearances than the other. Joseph Knight Sr. states that Joseph and Emma Smith drew of the characters exactly like the ancient, suggesting they took care in rendering facsimile copies of the characters on paper as they appeared on the plates. He also makes no remark as to the number of documents made. The 1838 history goes on to say that Mr. Martin Harris came to our place, got the characters, which I had drawn off of the plates, and started with them to the city of New York. Again, the text does not actually say or specify a number of documents. It only says he got the characters, without any reference to their physical context. So what did Harris present to Anthon? Based on these sources and others, particularly Harris's account in the history of the church, the following options are possible. 1, Harris presented a single document with 2 sets of characters and a translation of one of the sets. 2, Harris presented 2 documents with a set of character on each and a translation with one of them. 3, Harris presented 2 documents with one containing the 2 sets of characters and the other the translation. Or 4, Harris presented 3 documents with a different set of characters on 2 of the documents and a translation on the 3rd. Any of the documents could have writing on the front or back or both. Harris's report that he presented the first set of characters with the translation thereof and then received Anthon's reaction to them, but then later showed him a second set of characters and received a second reaction, is more consistent with options 2 or 4, but 2 is more likely since the first character set was presented with the translation thereof. Being open to the idea that there may have been more than one character set, if not transcript, document, let's inspect a little more the 2 responses of Anthon given in Harris's report. When Anthon is presented with the first set of characters and their translation, he, according to Harris, simply identified the characters as from the Egyptian and noted that the translation appeared to be correct. Although Martin Harris or Anthon could be using the term Egyptian generically for an ancient script similar to the phrase, "it's all Greek to me," the possibility that Anthon actually identified this set of characters as recognizably Egyptian should not be ruled out, since one of his main purposes for inspecting the characters was to identify their origin. In his academic position, Anthon would have been exposed to various forms of Egyptian writing and could likely identify them, regardless of any level of ability to translate such. When Anthon was presented with the second set of characters, those that were not yet translated, he seems less certain of any singular language origin the characters represented, stating that some looked Egyptian while others looked Chaldaic, Assyriac, or Arabic. As an aside, it should be noted that Anthon's own letters recounting Harris's visit unwittingly verified the antiquity of many of the characters because he speculated that they must have been copied from a book of various alphabets, albeit in a nonsensical manner. At face value, the difference between these 2 responses can be viewed as evidence that 2 different scripts were shown to Anthon. A script Anthon simply identified as Egyptian, and another script containing characters of a less certain origin. The possibility that 2 different scripts were shown to Anthon, one that he called Egyptian and one that he was not sure about, would actually be in harmony with claims within the Book of Mormon itself. Mormon and Moroni, who lived circa 400 AD, created an abridgment of the main Nephite records using a language that had been altered over their 1,000-year history, a language which they called Reformed Egyptian. It was reformed so much that he said, "None other people knoweth our language," suggesting that even an ancient Egyptian would not have understood their language in spite of the name given. Mormon, however, noted that as he was creating his abridgment of the main Nephite history, he searched among the records and found the set of plates that contained the small account written by Nephi, Jacob, and others down to King Benjamin. He felt they were important to include and indicates that he would simply put them with the remainder of his abridgment. Since Nephi and Jacob lived around 1,000 years before Mormon and Moroni, the language and characters on this small record would not have been altered Reformed Egyptian that Mormon and Moroni used. Rather, Nephi tells his readers plainly that he wrote using the language of the Egyptians, a language that his father Lehi knew how to read and he had taught to his children. It is known from archaeology that there was a scribal tradition using Egyptian hieratic in Israel during Nephi's day. So this script is the leading candidate for the script Nephi used when making his record. So if this additional small account of Nephi that Mormon put with the remainder of his abridgment had been written in the Egyptian language, like hieratic, that was used in Lehi and Nephi's day, while Mormon and Moroni's writings, including the title page, were written in the altered Reformed Egyptian of Mormon and Moroni, then it is reasonable to postulate that two different scripts would have been found on the bundle of plates that Joseph Smith received. This may explain the different reactions of Charles Anthon to the two character sets presented to him by Martin Harris. The one when he declared the characters to be Egyptian, and the other that he could not definitively identify, but said that they had some features of multiple ancient languages. Anthon himself would claim that the characters he saw were anything else but Egyptian hieroglyphics. However, it has already been noted that Anthon probably did tell Harris that some of the characters looked Egyptian, because after their meeting, it began to be circulated among the Latter-day Saints that Anthon told Harris some of the characters appeared to be shorthand Egyptian. This distinctive term was something the scholars, including Champollion himself, the scholars were using in their publications to specifically describe hieratic Egyptian script. It was unlikely a term that Harris would have known unless Anthon actually said it to him. That Egyptian hieratic is an attested scribal script in Nephi's Israel, and that Anthon supposedly said that the characters he saw looked like shorthand Egyptian, a term used by scholars to describe hieratic, could be significant. And more on this in a moment. So let's pivot for a moment and discuss Harris's report that Anthon indicated the translation from the Egyptian characters in the first transcript was correct. Although translating any Egyptian characters was still in its infancy, Anthon was familiar with Champollion's earliest work and mentioned it in his 1825 reworking of a classical dictionary. He also had a personal copy of Champollion's 1824 summary of the hieroglyphic system of the ancient Egyptians. In the least, Anthon likely understood from Champollion's work that Egyptian was a phonemic language, having characters representing sounds, not just logograms or symbolic writing. Consequently, for Anthon to have made any substantive and affirming remark concerning a translation, the translation that Harris presented would need to have been something simple, like alphabetic equivalences, and it would have to be related to the characters that Anthon recognized, not the Reformed Egyptian characters. While it is uncertain how deep Anthon's understanding of various Egyptian scripts and their values were, there is evidence in the sources, including some that are attributed to Joseph Smith's own parents, that suggest that Joseph Smith may have attempted to create and send something like an alphabet with Harris. Consequently, Anthon's comment to Harris that the translation from the Egyptian was correct may have been a simple acknowledgement of rudimentary ideas, such as characters having alphabetic features. Joseph Smith's initial interaction with the characters on the Egyptian papyri brought to him by Michael Chandler, from which the Book of Abraham comes, may have some bearing on this moment. Oliver Cowdery published a letter that he had written concerning this initial meeting, in which he says this: "While Michael Chandler was in Philadelphia, he used every exertion to find someone who could give him the translation of his papyrus, but he could not satisfactorily, though from some few men of the first eminence he obtained in a small degree the translation of a few characters. Mr. Chandler was told that his writings could be deciphered, and very politely gave me, Cowdery, a privilege of copying some 4 or 5 different sentences or separate pieces, stating at the same time that unless he found someone who could give him a translation soon, he would carry them to London." Cowdery goes on, "I'm a little in advance of my narration. The morning Mr. Chandler first presented his papyrus to Brother Smith, he was shown by the latter a number of characters like those upon the writings of Mr. Chandler, which were previously copied from the plates containing the history of the Nephites, or Book of Mormon." So Joseph Smith pulls out some characters from the plates and shows them to Chandler. They compare them to the documents that Chandler have. Being solicited by Mr. Chandler to give an opinion concerning his antiquities or translation of some of the characters, Brother Smith gave him the interpretation of some few for his satisfaction. "For your gratification, I will here annex a certificate, which I hold from under the hand of Mr. Chandler, unsolicited, however, by any person in this place, which will show how far he believed Brother Smith able to unfold from these long obscured rolls the wonders contained therein." And then Cowdery provides the certificate, which states, Kirtland, July 6, 1835, "This is to make known to all who may be desirous concerning the knowledge of Mr. Joseph Smith, Jr. in deciphering the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic characters in my possession, which I have in many eminent cities shown to the most learned, and from the information that I could ever learn or meet with, I find that Mr. Joseph Smith, Jr. to correspond in the most minute matters." An important thing to note here is that according to Chandler, no one in Philadelphia could actually translate the papyrus's words or sentences, and he even speaks of going to London to find somebody who could. A few eminent men did provide a translation to, quote, "a small degree," concerning a few characters. Consequently, Chandler's statement in his certificate that the eminent men's most basic assessment matched Joseph Smith's interpretations of some few characters strongly suggests that the prophet must have only provided undeveloped ideas about a few characters as well, not a translation of words or sentences. Chandler is only certifying a correlation of rudimentary ideas and nothing more. In a similar manner, the Anthon episode does not appear to deal with any translation of words or sentences. Anthon was not in a position to do so, but he likely did have a simple understanding of a few Egyptian characters, since the 1838 history reports that Joseph Smith only sent with Harris a translation of some characters. Any assumption that he translated words or sentences at this point goes beyond the text. The prophet's elementary effort appears to have corresponded in some way with Anthon's limited understanding, and so Anthon, like Chandler, gave a certificate affirming such, nothing more. In light of the above, it is reasonable to conclude that Joseph Smith only provided rudimentary interpretations of single characters from both the Egyptian papyri and on the gold plates the first time that he engages with them. According to the reports, the prophet's basic efforts were somehow in accordance with the limited understanding of Chandler's eminent men in Philadelphia and Harris's eminent man in New York, Charles Anthon. Neither the prophet nor the eminent men appeared to be translating or affirming the translation of words or sentences at this point. That effort would come later. One other important detail from Chandler's visit should be noted. Cowdery reports that Joseph Smith showed Chandler a number of characters from the Book of Mormon plates that apparently were like those upon the papyri that Chandler brought. It is significant that the papyri that Chandler brought were written in hieratic, as seen in the slide. This provides additional evidence that the Book of Mormon plates may have contained hieratic characters, characters that Anthon identified as shorthand Egyptian, a term used for hieratic characters in the scholarly literature of the day. That Anthon affirmed the first transcript as Egyptian and its translation of a few characters correct, but then struggled with the characters on the second transcript, matches Joseph Knight Sr.'s report that Harris found men that could translate some of the characters, but there were some characters they could not well understand. In the 1838 history, if the 1838 history is accurate and the two scripts were shown, then Anthon's report of a single transcript in his letters may be conflating everything into a single collection of characters. This would be understandable if Anthon was unable to discern the origin of the Reformed Egyptian characters that he was shown. The strangeness of the Reformed Egyptian characters, coupled with his declared bias against anything involving angelic visitations, may have swayed him to later deny any of the characters had authentic Egyptian connection. Since the characters that he viewed in the second set really were unrecognizable to him, they cast doubt on all the characters that he saw, even if some did appear to be legitimately similar to shorthand Egyptian, as he apparently said to Mr. Martin Harris. Many hieratic characters, especially if written in isolation, like in columns, can appear to be simple squiggles and flourishes of the pen, as Anthon claimed in his letters. So Anthon may have settled into that much safer conclusion when he was unable to make sense of the Reformed Egyptian script of Mormon and Moroni that no man knoweth. So again, not understanding the Reformed, he just assumed all of it was not understandable at that point. In light of all the above, the most likely scenario in which the details given in the official 1838 history are plausible would be as follows. Martin Harris obtained two documents from Joseph Smith, both containing copies of characters from the plates. Some kind of minimal effort of translation, similar to an alphabet, was added to the first set of characters. The first set of characters were likely written in an Egyptian script from Nephi's day that Anthon readily identified and related to shorthand Egyptian, a term being used for hieratic Egyptian in scholarly publications of the day. Indeed, hieratic is attested in the archaeological record of Jerusalem and surrounding areas of Nephi's day. 3. In order for Anthon's comment on the correctness of the translation to have any integrity, it could only be addressing broad ideas relative to individual characters, rather than translations of words or sentences. Anthon appears to have had some exposure to Champollion's early work on Egyptian characters, but it was too early for Anthon to have understood any translation in the fullest sense. It is not necessary to conclude that Anthon was full of hubris or pretended to know whether the translation was correct or not, nor is it necessary to conclude that Joseph Smith did any translation of words or sentences, just as he only initially appeared to provide rudimentary remarks concerning the Egyptian characters when he first encountered the papyri that Chandler brought, from which we get the Book of Abraham. 4. The second set of characters was a copy of Reformed Egyptian characters from the hand of Mormon and Moroni, with the exception of Nephi's small plates written in Egyptian. The whole of the gold plates, the 116-page manuscript, the words of Mormon and Moroni, the title page would have been written in the Reformed Egyptian. Since Reformed Egyptian is an altered script and language, Anthon could not readily identify its origins and speculates on several possibilities. 5. When Anthon learns that the characters are from someone claiming miraculous religious experience, and since he could not really discern the origin of many of the characters, he concludes that some of the characters must have been made up or copied from available books on alphabets in nonsensical ways, and any resemblance to Egyptian scripts that he may have noticed before are reduced to random flourishes of the pen. He concludes that none of it is Egyptian. As has been pointed out by scholars, regardless of Anthon's final conclusions, Harris experienced experience with Anthon and others satisfied him enough as to the authenticity of the characters on the plates that he answered the call that he was given in D&C 19, verses 26 and 27, to freely give of a significant portion of his substance to pay for the publication of the Book of Mormon. And one final note, given that it is likely that more than one document was shown to Anthon, the characters document that has been circulating in historical sources for some time now cannot be ruled out as one of them that was shown to him solely on the basis that Anthon's description does not appear to match it. Anthon's recollections in his letters may be referring to one of the other copies of characters. However, since Anthon's description in his personal recollections appear to focus more on the characters that he did not recognize, and they were in columns, then it's still probable that the characters document was one of many other copies made from the plates, as others have already pointed out. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. That was really interesting. That was an area that, I think back in my seminary days, and you learn about the Book of Mormon translation, and they talk about the Anthon manuscript for just a moment or two, and other than getting the one line, there's just not much there that people usually talk about.
Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, get one out of the way right away that's not quite related, but is still related to your field. Since you're talking about Reformed Egyptian and the characters, I see daily on X and on TikTok and on Reddit, there's no such thing as Reformed Egyptian. So how would you respond to something like that?
Well, it seems to be pretty unique. Mormon and Moroni say this is a language that's been altered by us and no other person knows it. So, yeah, it's not readily available around the world. It seems to be something that's unique to them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just got a question in. How similar to Hieratic do you think the characters on the documents were? We know that they were modified and adapted over time, so it would have been impossible to actually read them, but do you think it started off as Hieratic or Palestinian Hieratic?
Yeah, I think the Hieratic in the small plates, or the small record of Nephi, would have looked like the Hieratic of the Egyptians of that day. So very similar. Yeah. By the time we get to Mormon and Moroni, not similar at all. I think they're completely reformed and different, so that it's no longer recognizable as Hieratic, which is why I think Anthon says, this looks like some Egyptian, but it looks like Arabic and Akkadian. He kind of throws out a whole bunch of different ideas because he can't quite nail down what these characters represent.
So what we're arguing here is Joseph Smith not only made up the Book of Mormon, but also made up Egyptian characters that look like real Egyptian characters, and that the scholars of the day thought looked like Egyptian characters, and then matched I don't know what you'd call it, the progression in the Book of Mormon went from the small plates to the other plates, that Joseph Smith had a different set of characters for that, just to make his story work.
Yeah. I think it's again, it just shows some complexity here that maybe we haven't really thought through. Looking at Anthon's two different responses. One, he just says, "Oh, that's Egyptian," and the other one, he's like, "I'm not quite sure." Right? That seems to match what the Book of Mormon is saying, that it had Egyptian characters and then some that nobody would know. Well, the Reformed Egyptian that nobody else would understand. And so that's some complexity, I think, that's kind of interesting when you compare, those details with what we know from history now. And we know, again, that Hieratic was a script that was a scribal tradition in Israel in Lehi and Nephi's day. And the fact that Anthon called it shorthand Egyptian, which was a scholarly term for hieratic, and that the Book of Mormon characters, when Joseph Smith pulls them out and shows Chandler, he says, here are the characters from the Book of Mormon, and he compares them to Chandler's papyri that he brings, and they talk about how that they match, that
Right.
suggests, and the Chandler's papyri are written in hieratic. Just kind of all this kind of comes together in a beautiful way to suggest that there's some hieratic characters on the plates.
Yeah, that was the other thing that came across to me is that Chandler was, we not just have Anthon and his manuscript, the manuscript going there, but we also have Chandler as almost like a second witness to the same thing, that
Yeah.
the characters really were hieratic, at least at some point.
Yeah.
And they called it shorthand Egyptian,
Yeah.
which as you say, a person pulling stumps in upstate New York would have been really familiar with that term, being sarcastic, of course.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and I think that what's even more fantastic is that these two stories, the stories of Anthon and Chandler, have so many similar characteristics, right? Anthon is an eminent man who is trying to provide some, response to Harris's documents. But then Chandler says that he went to eminent men to try to get some responses. And they're both providing very rudimentary responses because that's all they knew. Right? None of them knew how to translate words and phrases. But then both provide certificates, as well, which is interesting, to say that Joseph Smith's explanations of the characters, again, not words and sentences, but Joseph Smith gave some rudimentary explanations because that's all they had to compare with. The eminent men in Philadelphia did not provide translations. Chandler is clear on that point. He says they only provided a small degree of some few characters, right, some idea. And he says that's what matched what Joseph Smith said. And so, anyway, yeah, I think it's just pretty incredible to see those two stories be like witnesses to one another.
Yeah, and Joseph Smith didn't really get his Near Eastern Studies degree at Dartmouth or anything like that.
Yeah.
It's just, are your references to history 1838 A1, for example, only found in the Joseph Smith Papers Project, or do you know?
I'm not sure I understand the question. I mean, the 1838 history is in the Joseph Smith Papers Project.
It says,
but what I quoted is actually in the Joseph Smith history in the Pearl Gate Price. So I did use the 1838 history just to kind of give you the original source. Mm-hmm. But it's not much different from what we have in our Pearl Gate Price. So it's been canonized.
Right.
Yeah.
So what I take out of your talk and such is the story that we were told about the coming forth of the Book of Mormon and the characters and what they're all about matches other not only matches the documents that we have, but also matches the things that one would expect, both from the characters and from the preeminent men and how they would have had understanding of those things.
Yeah, and I really wanted to make sure we emphasize that in the past we've kind of like thrown Anthon under the bus and said that, he's obviously faking it. He doesn't know how to translate, but he's actually doing the best he can based on his actual understanding.
Right.
And we can look at this a little bit differently and give him some grace, but at the same time not undo what Martin Harris said happened.
Yeah.
So,
Got another question from our audience. In the characters document, several characters are repeated. Based on the frequency of repeating, has anyone extrapolated how many characters would have been in the alphabet?
I'm not sure. I know that, now I can't remember who, I'm sorry for your good work, whoever did this, but somebody recently talked about how the characters repeat and also in a reverse order, so there's a chiastic structure in the characters document. Remember this?
I do remember it. I can't think of who did it all of a sudden. So I
thought that was pretty insightful to see that pattern.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm not sure if we've been able to nail down any kind of full alphabet from the document.
Yeah. So we really appreciate your time on this. This has been really enlightening. I learned some things I had no idea about. And again, my background, even though we're answering questions all the time and we get things, is I was raised in seminary and institute just like everybody else, and read the history books there, and it's I think it's easy to gloss over things and not recognize really the import on the detail, just because the detail really does support the story.
That's usually how it works, right? Because we make so many assumptions based on very broad views, but when we get into the nitty-gritty details, oftentimes Joseph comes off vindicated.
Yeah, his story should have fallen apart, and it doesn't.
Yeah,
it doesn't fall, or didn't, however you want to put it. So,
agree.
So thank you very much. At this time, just a quick reminder that if you want to have more programs like this, It's free for you, but it costs us money. So please donate. Any donation of any amount is welcome. And we're going to start our next talk right at 2 o'clock in just about 5 minutes. So thank you very much.